Pearling in Western Australia existed well before European settlement. Coastal dwelling Aborigines had collected and traded pearl shell as well as trepang and tortoise with fishermen from Sulawesi for possibly hundreds of years. After settlement, the Aborigines were used as slave labor in the emerging commercial industry. Pearling centered first around Nickol Bay and Exmouth Gulf and then around Broome to become the largest in the world by 1910. It remains an important part of the Western Australian eco-early history. In Australia, the harvesting of pearl shell began millennia ago with the Aborigines. They did not dive but were so successful in harvesting the shell that the patterns of distribution or trade in the shell that they harvested have been traced throughout many parts of the continent. They also had enough surplus to engage in an overseas trade. This phase began with the visits of the Makassar and trepangers to the northern coasts in the late 17th or early 18th century. The trade resulted in the exchange of trepang, turtles and pearl shell for tobacco, rice and axes. There was also violence, including the abduction of men and women. As a result, both groups were often armed and the Aborigines learned to treat any newcomers with suspicion. From a European perspective, William Dampier and then the French explorers saw at Shark Bay and Dampier, Stokes, Gray and F. T. Gregory found on the northwest coast, while anchored at Nickol Bay, waiting for him to return from his explorations. Gregory's crew obtained a quantity of shell and a good pearl. While Gregory reported on this in his widely read journals and accounts, it appears that others were more secretive. Some visiting whalers, for example, also knew of the shell, having either harvested shell themselves, or having acquired it in trade with the Aborigines. Recorded as being on the coast in great numbers after the 1840s, they also frequented areas where shell is found, including Nickol Bay and Shark Bay. Pragmatic, and keen to guard any potential lucrative return, they kept few historical records. Northwest shell was found on the wreck of the American whaling bark Cervantes that was lost while sealing about 120 nautical miles north of Fremantle in 1844. For example, the first stage of the European pearling industry, wading for shell. The European pearling industry began in the 1850s at Shark Bay, where pearls were found in the pink tarda albina oyster in relatively large numbers. The industry soon folded, however. At Nickol Bay, decorative pearl shells made by local Aborigines from pink tarda maxima were noted by European explorers. The industry began in the mid-1860s with pastoral workers who collected shell in shallow waters, either from shore or in small boats. In 1866, a former shareholder of the defunct Dennis and Plains Company, W.F. Tays, proved very successful as a full-time pearler. Others followed, and in these instances, the boat provided transport for personnel and shell to and from remote beds, or across deeper water to drying banks and reefs. There was no diving at this time, as the shallow waters initially provided enormous returns to the Europeans and their Aboriginal laborers, who waded and recovered shell as the tide receded. During the late 1860s, many more boats left Fremantle and the pearling industry at Torres Strait, Queensland, for the new fishery at Nickol Bay with its port of Tientsin Harbour. Thus, new technology, in the form of small boats, large containers and then larger vessels operating independently, or as mother boats to a number of dinghies, were the first major advances that the Europeans applied to the pearling industry. Walter Padbury, the noted Perth-based merchant pastoralist and ship owner, then sent a large boat north up to the early pastoralist John Withnell in partnership with others. They also proved successful, as did many others, including Charles Harper, who built his own boat. The amateur Charles Broadhurst, a noted entrepreneur and at least two sons of government resident R.J. Scholl, This eventually caused overharvesting of the shallows and a shortage of shell. This led the industry into its second stage, and a transition took place from wading in the shallows into the use of skin divers. In most cases, however, the transition from wading to diving took place during 1868. While Broadhurst and a few other proprietors experimented during the 1860s with the use of breathing apparatus by professional divers, it proved at the time to be expensive, unreliable and dangerous. While local Aborigines were excellent swimmers, known to have covered great distances over water, sometimes to escape imprisonment, unlike the counterparts in some other parts of Australia, they had no cause to dive in conditions where the tidal range provided all they needed. Many were also succumbing to diseases to which they had not previously been exposed, as well as accidents. This led to recruitment from the convicts on the native prison on Rottnest Island. Broadhurst was criticized for harsh treatment of at least one indigenous employee, while some pearlers abducted and/or forcibly retained the divers. The second stage of the European pearling industry, naked diving. By September 1868, soon after the beginning of the warm weather, the shell harvesters were operating in depths of around 10 meters. Then, inured to hardship, and initially supremely fit, with wonderful eyesight, the Aborigines began to emulate, and sometimes surpass, the feats of the others already engaged in the industry elsewhere throughout the world. At the time, the following was said of their skills and abilities. The powers of the natives in diving, especially the females, are spoken of as something wonderful. They go down to depths of 7 fathoms and remain below a time that astonishes the white employers. Called naked diving, the methods used are described in 2 primary sources. One, the diaries and official dispatches of government resident and pearler R.J. Scholl, and the other, the better-known and widely published accounts of E.W. Streeter. He wrote that right up until the late 1880s, harvesters were operating from dinghies, the largest containing 6 to 8 divers. They often went up against the tide and, when ready, the divers went overboard. The leader, most often a white man, then stood in the stern of the dinghy, drifting along with the divers until good beds were found. There he would try to hold the boat in position against the tide and make repeated runs over the bed. Everyone worked hard and traveled great distances, for they could end up kilometers from the mother boat, and had to return to it at the end of the day. The tides were an advantage in this instance, allowing the divers to be carried relatively effortlessly across far more ground than they could ever cover on their own. The majority entered the water feet first, turning as the head submerged towards the bottom. They did not use stones to speed up the descent, nor did they use other aids. A fair day's work for a naked diver in the Northwest industry was considered to be the recovery of 10 to 25 pairs at a general rate of 1 pair of shells in 8 dives. 2 to 3 pairs were frequently brought up in the one dive. The Shark Bay pearling industry. Frank Cadell was also operating at Shark Bay in this period, and in this era, dredging rapidly became the most efficient means of obtaining the shell, which was noted more for the pearls rather than the shell, as was the situation further north. When SS Antho sank beneath him late in 1872, Broadhurst joined Cadell at Shark Bay there, proving extremely successful at one stage, recovering over 200 ounces of pearls. The publicity surrounding the successes resulted in a virtual gold rush centered on Wailea. The importation of Malay indentured labor ceases. The use of Malays on the northwest coast grew dramatically and reached its peak around August 1875. At the beginning of the 1875 sixth season, 22 large vessels arrived in the north of Western Australia, mainly from Kupang and Makassar. On board the vessels were around 75 white men, about 770 Malays, an unspecified number of Port Essington Aboriginals, 17 Chinese, 24 women and a few children. Cadell then began to cause problems for all the employers by mistreating his Malay labourers. Calls were made for his apprehension, and both he and Broadhurst became embroiled in a great scandal for the abuse, non-payment and non-repatriation of the labourers at Shark Bay. The matter was eventually resolved by the Dutch Governor-General at Batavia in August 1875 by enacting what a Western Australian administration, unable to control the excesses on its own coast, dubbed to be wise and humane regulations. They also led to the near abandonment of the use of Malays on the north coast. In 1874 there were 225 Malays employed in the fishery. In 1875 there were 989, in the following year none, and in 1876 there were only 24 in the industry. The pearlers moved further afield. As an indicator of the mobility of the fleet, Government Resident R.J. Scholl made a visit to Flying Foam Passage in Nickol Bay in the first week of February when the yield was good, and recorded the numbers of people and boats above. By the time of the writing of his official report on the same subject at the end of March 1873, however, the supply had diminished, indicating the rapidity with which beds were exploited and abandoned. Several boats moved elsewhere, some to the west of Nickol Bay, further still to Exmouth Gulf, and others east to Condon at Apidamara near Port Hedland. A few went much further. Eventually the centre of activity drifted away from Nickol Bay and its Cossack and from other centres such as Condon, Banamara onto Roebuck Bay, where modern-day Broome is situated. The Broome era, as the centre of activity drifted away from Nickol Bay and its port of Cossack, and from other centres such as Condon, Banamara, where the drying beds were once prolific, the industry came to centre on Roebuck Bay, where modern-day Broome is situated. Their diving apparatus, as was used, and E.W. Streeter by his own account became acknowledged as its first successful operator. In 1884, 9 vessels had the diving gear. By the end of the 1885-6 season, 34 of the 54 vessels operating on the pearling grounds were using standard dress, and in the 1887-8 season of the 120 vessels, only 2 used the naked diving oar method, with the exception of Shark Bay, where diving had long since ceased to be a feature, and where in 1886 the Chinese also proved very efficient. The advent of apparatus diving produced a change in the recruitment of Malays. It became biased specifically towards those more capable of handling the technology, with Minilaman preferred over those less capable of handling the gear. Aboriginal divers also disappeared from the industry almost overnight. Soon the Japanese divers came to dominate the industry. By 1910, nearly 400 pearling luggers and more than 3,500 people were fishing for shell in waters around Broome, making it the world's largest pearling center. The majority of the workers were Japanese and Malaysian, but also included were Chinese, Filipino, Aborigines, Kupanga and Makassar, as well as indigenous Australians and people from Europe. By the 1930s, pearl luggers were mainly motorized, and the use of mechanical air pumps allowed boats to use 2 divers. The industry suffered from a high death toll, with hazards from shark attack, cyclones and frequently the bends. 4 tropical cyclones hit the area between 1908 and 1935, and over 100 boats and 300 500 people were lost during that time, as evidenced by the numerous graves in the Japanese cemetery in Broome. At the time of the World War I, the price of mother-of-pearl plummeted with the invention and expanded use of plastics for buttons and other articles, which had previously been made of shell. Broome had been the center of an industry that supplied up to 70% of global demand for the shell. Concerns regarding overharvesting by the industry led to the voluntary Northern Territory Pearling Ordinance in 1931. Pearlers such as Giro Muramats continued to operate out of Cossack. By 1939, only 73 luggers and 565 people were left in the industry, and during the World War II, pearling virtually stopped. Japanese divers discreetly went home or were interned, and Broome was bombed, destroying many of the remaining luggers. After the war, as few as 15 boats employing around 200 people remained. Cultured pearls. Due to the prospect of an adverse reaction in the natural pearling industry, the Australian government, through the 1922 Pearling Act, prohibited anyone in Australia from artificially producing cultivated pearls. The act was repealed in 1949. In 1956, a joint Japanese-Australian venture was set up at Kuri Bay, 420 kilometers north of Broome, as a cultured pearl farm, named Pearls Proprietary Limited. The company was owned by Mail & Co., Broome Pearlers Brown & Giro Limited, and the Ottogar Dye Company. The Japanese-owned Nippon Pearl Company handled distribution and marketing. The principal was Tokuichi Kuribayashi, who became highly influential following the death of Kokichi Mikimoto. Mikimoto, Kuribayashi and another man, Tatsuhames, had all been involved in the invention of cultured pearls around 1900. Kuribe was named after Mr. Kuribayashi. By 1981, there were 5 pearl farms operational: Kuribe, Portsmouth, Cygnet Bay, and 2 in Broome's Roebuck Bay. The industry today includes 19 of Australia's 20 cultured pearl farms and generates annual exports of $200 million and employs approximately 1,000 people.